Hey guys and girls, Board now back with you, and this is going to be another horror movie review, and this is one of the most talked about and anticipated films of 2019, and that is Doctor Sleep, the long-awaited sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which of course came out in 1980, and I did a review of that not too long ago on this channel, so you can find that. I'll put it in the link in the description to this video, so you can watch that and then watch this review if you like to do it in that order. So long-awaited sequel came out over the last month or so. I saw it this week at my local picture house, and very interesting film. I have some quite strong thoughts on it, sort of either way, and it comes from a follow-on novel by Stephen King, which he did on the back of his original The Shining. And as I discussed on the Shining video, he originally, well, he still isn't a big fan of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. You know, he felt it didn't really do justice to what he was trying to do in his novel. So that's the context. And I mean, for the sake of, obviously The Shining is held up as a great sort of horror masterpiece, one of the great horrors of all times for a lot of people who know me, people who saw my previous Shining video will know I have slightly different views, although I do respect it a lot as a movie, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. So for a lot of people who are really pro The Shining and think it is a masterpiece and all the rest, I think that crowd were quite down on the sequel, on the novel. I mean, I'll get to the film sequel, and certainly reviews have been mixed on this film version, Doctor Sleep. So I'm going to get into it. It's directed by Mike Flanagan, who has some really good horror pedigree. You know, I'm a pretty big Flanagan fan. I absolutely love his film Hush from a few years ago. That's really good tense horror, really good sort of character-driven, all set in the one location horror. I highly recommend that. It's quite underrated, I'd say, actually. He also did a great job with the Haunting of Hill House, the series on Netflix, the sort of one-off anthology style series. I say anthology because of course he's going to do another series based on The Turn of the Screw, which comes out next year on Netflix, and that's something I'll definitely be reviewing. He also did Gerard's Game, which is another Stephen King adaptation that was on Netflix. That was overall good as well, I think, with one or two flaws. So, you know, generally what I've seen from Flanagan, I've been impressed with. I know some people have issue with some of his films and the endings of his films and, you know, particular things. So, I mean, probably something I'll throw in here is the fact that I think Flanagan as a director is very good, but maybe as a writer isn't so great. I don't know if I'd say he was a terrible writer, but I think he is weaker as a writer than he is as a director. But certainly as a director, I think he understands how to create atmosphere and mood. And is quite effective, I think, as a horror director. But I mention him as a writer because he also wrote this. He did the script, which he took over actually from the previous script, which had been put forward by Akiva Goldman's. So that script was originally sort of completed, and I think it was set for release about 2017 originally, the film, but then it stalled because they didn't get backing for that particular version. And when Flanagan came in, he was either asked or he decided to rewrite the script, so he's writer on this as well as directing. And so it picks up, you know, sort of years after The Shining, the original Shining, and it follows the character of Danny Torrance, obviously the young boy in the film, and here he's played as a grown-up by Ewan McGregor. Although we do see him as a boy sort of briefly in the past at the beginning of the film, so sort of just a matter of, months or weeks after the events of what happened in The Shining. And we do get the odd flashback throughout the film of him and his mum, but generally most of it is McGregor as the older Danny Torrance, so he's still dealing with the psychological ramifications of what happened in The Shining. He's obviously got this power, this gift called The Shining, which he's starting to explore and discover more about, and he's still having flashbacks from that time, so it proves quite a trauma for him, quite a burden. He becomes a drunk. He's having, personal problems with alcohol and what have you, and he tends to sleep around quite a lot. So he's a very troubled, cut-off sort of individual. And the film, it actually jumps back and forth quite a lot, the film. Danny isn't as central as you might expect. There's quite a few characters and places that are juggled. So Danny basically goes to travel to this new town and goes to set up there, basically, and the idea is that he's escaping his past and he wants to settle down and escape the whole Shining, his powers and the Shining gift. At the same time, you get this cult led by the Rebecca Ferguson Rose character, who are like seeking out all the individuals, because there's multiple people with this gift who have the Shining power and to use it for their own sort of purposes, to sort of use that power to feed off and to basically create a situation where they can have, a high level power, potentially live very long and powerful life. And so they're seeking all the different people out. And so they start seeking this young girl out who is said to be one of the most gifted, called Abby. And she's actually a seer sort of thing. She has a particular kind of shining gift. So she's seen as one most powerful. So slowly those two halves, like the Danny plot and the Abby plot, slowly comes together as this cult is tracking down Abby, and the young girl Abby contacts Danny basically through psychic powers, so she has that sort of power. Quite a nice little touch there, because actually there's a whiteboard in Danny's room at the place he's staying. And it becomes a nice little joke, because the woman, to remind him to pay his rent, sort of writes it on the whiteboard. But then Danny starts getting psychic messages on this whiteboard from the girl, because she wants him to sort of come with her and sort of help. So there you have it. That's the setup. So a fair amount going on in the film. And overall, I liked it. I actually liked it a fair bit. I thought it was good generally, with a few flaws. I think it's good because it does what a sequel should do to what is held up as a classic as The Shining. And what it does is it expands on the universe of the original film. It opens up the stories, the characters. It sort of explores some of those ideas and possibilities. I sort of like the fact that it looks at like this idea of a cult and the underground community, and there's actually some quite in-depth and intriguing writing around these characters, like the Rebecca Ferguson and her community. They're not just sort of cast off and sort of branded as black and white sort of villains. There is some sort of subtlety going on there. Yeah, and I think that's partly in the performances, particularly Rebecca Ferguson. But you actually spend quite a lot of time with these characters and get to know them. But it does open up the powers of it does, obviously, that is the idea of the movie. It does go to some dark places. It's very daring. I mean, we get scenes where a child, for example, is basically killed for his powers. A young kid who's sort of playing baseball, and the cult have sort of tracked him down. And they end up, stripping him of his powers, and like sort of stabbing him. So they kill him, and so there are scenes like that are really edgy, really uncomfortable. So it impressed me for what's a fairly mainstream film, at least on paper. Then they did go to some dark places. So credit to Flanagan for that. And it was an intriguing, character-driven sort of film. And I think, again, good atmosphere, powerful atmosphere. I sort of feel similar to the original Shining, where I think it's a distinct film which has a lot of atmosphere and mood and intriguing moments and characters, but ultimately it is still quite flawed. There are still ideas in it that come off as quite goofy and cheesy. And so, I mean, ironically, I'm in a similar place, although I can see, obviously, the argument for it being not as good. And I mean, maybe overexposed, and now in the era of CG, not that there's a massive amount of CG, but when they do go for the CG, they really go for the CG. And so that was overdone. I think that became a bit overblown, and there are scenes that are a bit melodramatic at times. So that would be a fair criticism of this film. I think another problem, and this is maybe my main critique, is I know they recreated or sort of decided to use a lot of the footage from the original film, and they put it in the film, and that's partly because of Danny's issues, because he's reliving these events in his head, and he's, so I can see why they're there, but that was a cheap sort of gimmick in a way. That stuff really didn't work, or they should have cut down on it maybe. But just to literally recreate those moments, it just took me out of this film a bit too much and reminded me of The Shining. And I just think if you're going to do a Shining sequel, do a Shining sequel. Don't remind me of the previous films. Obviously, some of that stuff has to be there. But as much as you can, I think they should have done a complete new film, and once it gets going, I think they probably do that more often than not. There are those jarring sort of moments along the way. The ending is a bit like that because they end up returning to the hotel, which from a plot point of view it makes sense, and it's a great way to end Danny's story. But yeah, they do that a bit too much. And also there's this issue, because it's been years and because Jack Nicholson has aged and looks very different. You get a scene of someone doing a Jack Nicholson impression, essentially, as that character from the original, the Jack Torrance character. So roaming around with an axe, and it just feels so jarring because it's like an impression. And I thought that especially with the mum character when we see that early in the film. So it's someone, again, they couldn't get Shirley Duvall back, so it's someone basically doing a Shirley Duvall impression as Wendy from the first film. So those scenes are really clunky, and they drag the film down at the beginning. You get a few later on, but ultimately once it gets into the plot and characters and what it's doing as a sequel, I think it's an effective sequel. It was for me. As I said, some issue with CGI at times, some quite melodramatic moments. But those moments aside, I think it's an intriguing watch. It's a long watch. It's 2.5 hours. It maybe could have been shortened a bit. But overall, it engrossed me. It didn't really feel like a long film. I was interested in the characters. As I said, I really like the way they expand on the world. I really like the ideas to do with community and to do with energy and power. And the shades of light and dark, the villains weren't just one dimensional. There was a sort of a human side to them. Rebecca Ferguson maybe steals the film, actually. She has a real presence. She's really good at playing villains. But she has a lot of charisma. She brings, a sort of a good depth to it. But as I said, has a presence. Is very wicked, but brings a lot to the character. She's really good fun in that role, creates a really engaging sort of character. You really feel her pain at times, even though she's a very manipulative, sort of self-serving character. Ewan McGregor, I think, proves really perfect casting for grown-up Danny, because he really grounds it. And in a film where it's very theatrical at time, you do get a lot of kind of overacting isn't really the word, but it's very operatic, very dramatic, high energy performances at times. So it's good to have those more grounded, understated performances, and that's what McGregor does. He actually does brooding very well, which is funny because you don't see that often from McGregor. But I think as he's, aged a bit more over the years, he has become more. He's always been a really good actor, but in this sort of role, you see how brooding, understated, believable he is. You really believe he is carrying the weight of what happened years ago, and is really fighting his demons. It's a really convincing performance, I thought. And the young girl is fantastic. Sorry, it's her debut. Her name's Kyliegh Curran, I'm going to say Kyliegh Curran. Her first ever film, it turns out, and she is brilliant. She's an absolute natural as Abby, the other sort of main character of the piece. Really impressive. I mean, maybe they went for her because she had no experience of acting, so they thought they could capture something quite raw and natural without having these ideas of, how should I act? So that sometimes can work really well, and it seems like it does in this case. But based on this film, her performance as Abby, I think she could have a real future. She's very good. You really engage in her. And her character's fascinating as well. I think she has this really strong sense of morals and morality, and wants to use her gift for good, essentially, and is very conscious of the effects on people around her, like her parents. I mean, it goes to a dark place with her father at time. He sort of gets drawn in, and he's sort of killed off. So 3 really good performances that really elevated the film, I think. I did find the whole drug metaphor very weird. That never quite worked for me. So there's this thing where this cult of people sort of feed off, it's either like the dust or the energy off the people, and it's like this whole drug metaphor when they're literally breathing, and visually it works quite well, but it's just odd, and it's like this drug metaphor almost. It's a bit on the nose, those moments, but anyway. But some really powerful scenes, some really dark scenes, intriguing characters, a lot of style to it, and I think it makes sense. And it ended up back at the hotel, and Danny had to face this. He had to sort of come full circle and confront his demons, and ultimately he sacrifices himself at the end, which is a really sort of powerful sort of redemption type message. And it makes sense, and that's kind of how the whole saga sort of ends for him. It's like the completion of his narrative. And there's a few clunky moments at the hotel, but I did enjoy the standoff between him and Rebecca Ferguson. It was a good way to bring the narrative together, and their face-off and back and forths were really dramatic and engaging. And I really like the relationship between Danny and the young girl and how that plays out. And it did fool me for a minute when he appears to her at the end. I thought that he had survived actually, and they'd sort of fooled us when the hotel goes up in flames. But it's a really good like redemption sort of thing. And there's nice little touches. I really like the fact that Danny's, where the title comes from, Doctor Sleep. He works in like a care home, or he visits a care home. It's never made clear whether he actually works there. And he keeps saying, "I'm not a doctor." But there's this cat at the care home that hangs around and essentially goes on the bed of people who are going to die. You know, they're not far from the end. So the idea is it can sense when a person's time is up. And Danny has interaction with those things and with those people, and that's why he's called Doctor Sleep, because he's kind of around for when they're due to take their final sleep. And he sort of puts it in perspective. He has this perspective on the afterlife and death and what have you. And that's another thing I like about the movie. It goes into that and explores that in quite a satisfying sort of way. But those moments are really actually quite touching as well. So I'm always interested in stuff that deals with the afterlife and death and mortality in such a different sort of way, and it has quite a positive and touching spin on it. But so there's a lot of, I think, really intriguing mythologies and ideas in this film. It does open up the world of The Shining and their gifts and the power. I think I think if you're picking apart the script, it is quite sort of ropey at times. The structure is a bit uneven, and as I said, the weakest moments are the moment where it's sort of trying a bit hard to connect to the original film and almost being The Shining Mark II, if you like, rather than doing its own thing. When it sticks to being its own thing and being something that complements the original film but is different in its own way, it works very well. I think it's a very strong sequel in that sense. It gets that balance. I think on the one hand, it's a film which feels like a Shining film, if you like. It has that distinct sort of atmosphere. It has some, intriguing and bold ideas. Plenty to leave you talking. It's very much a psychological film like the first one was, but it is its own entity as well. It does its own thing. I think it's fair to say it's less of a horror movie than the original. I think the original was more of a horror movie, because I think this is more of a supernatural, psychological type thriller. The original was more of horror because of the one location, mostly at the house, and the whole thing there, and the ghost story. And I think in some ways you might say the original was better because it had that sense of mystery, whereas this opens things up and it's not quite as maybe unpredictable as the original film. The original had that intrigue and the mystery and the whole ghost story, but there's plenty of that in this film. It's just maybe as a sequel, as what naturally happens, you lose a lot of that sometimes. But as a character study, as a really ambitious film which did something in its own right, I think it holds up pretty well. And for me, at least, as someone who isn't quite the massive Shining fan, I think it's at least on a par with the first film, in my opinion. Flawed, but very distinct and very, very effective in the good things that it does. I would definitely watch this again. I had, with one or two nitpicks, I had a good time with this. It is less of a horror movie, I do think. People might disagree. You can let me know that in the comments, but which funny with it being Mike Flanagan. Maybe it's just the nature of the story. It was always going to be less of a horror movie than the original, but there's certainly good horror moments in it. But I would probably say similar to the original film. Bits of it I found unsettling, some very unsettling stuff, but yeah, maybe it was more distinct in the atmosphere, and intriguing stuff going on, some disturbing stuff, but it never felt that scary to me, a bit like the original film. But there you have it. That's my general thoughts on Doctor Sleep, which overall I am giving a thumbs up. It's a good movie, I think. So as far as ratings go, 7 out of 10 for me. I think it's a very successful sequel. You know, the things that are wrong with it, I think, do drag it down a fair bit. So I can't really go higher than a 7. I think part of the appeal is that the three lead performances are so good. They're so on point. They really carry you through a lot of the rough stuff. And you've got a good director at the helm. Really brings a lot of mood and atmosphere to the project. Some issues with the writing, but you know, there was enough intrigue for me to be carried along. And as I said, the three leads are really, really good. So they carry much of it along with some of the direction. But that is my thoughts on Doctor Sleep, the recent shining sequel. You can disagree or agree, whichever way you want, in the comments. Let me know what you think about it. How does it compare to the original film? Let me know these things. And I'm going to be back with more horror movie reviews on the channel in the coming days, because I'm going to be doing, in quite quick order, hopefully, Black Christmas 2006, so the original remake, and then Black Christmas 2019, the most recent reimagining, if you like, which I saw just last night. So more horror movie reviews to come in the coming days. But thanks for listening to this review, and I'll see you guys again soon.